everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Deep Thoughts. And today we are talking about SAO, Alicization, War of Underworld, Episode 3, the final load test. But before we get into it, I do want to give a big shout out to my boy at the Chillas N1 for sharing last week's video over on Twitter, and if you too would like to have your name shouted out in next week's SAO video, then be sure to share this video around on the internet, and then tag me at JoJo Talks Too Much over on Twitter, and I will be sure to shout your name out in next week's video. Okay, so with that said, with the title, like the final load test, right? Something that sounds ominous and spooky and like really intense. You would assume that would mean that this week's episode is really baller, but it is not the case. This is a very, very, very slow episode this week. Now, at the same time, you kind of need these episodes sometimes so that you can catch everybody up as to what's been going on. And I recognize that, I respect that, but it doesn't make them any less slow. And there's ways to make these sorts of episodes where it's heavy on the techno-babble make sense and be cool. And I think that there was an effort made, but this is easily the moment of the show that I can see people pointing to as like, oh, this show's boring, when you know that's not the case. You know that Alicization has been absolutely fantastic. And it's episodes like this that do make me go like, oh goodness, because this one, I'm just gonna be real, and you guys know that I love SAO. I know that I love SAO, and you know that by next week I'm probably gonna forget this episode existed because of how hype I'll likely be for next week's episode. But this week kind of bummed me out. I was not bummed me out, but kind of just bored me to tears. It was a very slow episode. Not a whole lot happens. It's basically just explaining where the characters are going to go from here. It's a very transitionary episode. And like I said, you can make those fit well within the structure of the show, and sometimes they can be kind of a slog. In this case, it leans more towards the latter than the former. And I mean, it's too bad because the episode's description on Crunchyroll, just before I loaded up the episode, I glanced at the description on the side, and the description actually had me really intrigued. I think the premise for what's going to happen going forward is actually really neat. Like, I had assumed like that we were going to get this like really intense first meeting between Alice and Mr. Miller, as he comes to be called, and it's because the premise is that these characters have actually met Mr. Miller, the main antagonist. They met him in, I believe it was GGO, and I think that premise is really friggin' cool. In fact, remember when we saw Asuna's like GGO outfit, that fight that they're having with those like military folks? That's Mr. Miller, like way back at the start of Alicization. Like that to me was really cool. The fact that it all tied back together, I thought that was really neat. And it's interesting because I think Mr. Miller had the potential to be a really cool villain, and I think he still does. There's this little flash when he's diving into Underworld where we see this like girl reach out to him, and he reaches back for her, and I'm like, okay. So we have a little snippet of like, okay, this character has a little bit more going on beneath the surface than may appear. Because at first I was like, man, this guy seems like generic bad guy 101. It's cool how he connects to our characters from the beginning of the series, or the season rather, but it kind of sucks that he's just sort of like, I have to get the thing, and I'm bad, so I don't care what I gotta do to get the thing, I'm gonna get the thing. And then that one moment kind of made me go like, okay, well maybe there's a little bit more going on beneath the surface. And the fact that he was curious about like the whole like clones, like when they mentioned like that the Fluct like can operate as cloning people, like and the fact that he sees that girl, that makes me think that there's a little bit more going on with Mr. Miller than may appear on the surface. And I would be curious to know a little bit more about him. At first I was very very dismissive of him, but by the end of the episode, as I was left basically to ponder about other things, since my mind was getting distracted while watching the episode, it made me realize that I want to know more about Mr. Miller, just less like techno-babbly talk and actual like character growth, and actually have him talk to the other characters. That's fine. You guys know me. I love talking scenes. I love cafe scenes. As long as they actually talk about character growth or storyline stuff without it putting me to sleep like it unfortunately does in this week's episode. Because yeah, unfortunately the first half of this episode is just focused on Miller's squad talking about nothing. Like essentially just talking about, oh, this is Underworld. This is how Underworld works. And it's like, yeah, This is episode 3 of the second part of Alicization. I am pretty clear on how Underworld works at this point, and most of the audiences as well. And it's basically just catching them up to speed, which I recognize that you have to catch characters up to speed, but when it's something like that, I feel like you can just be like, have the nerdy guy be like, okay, I gotta tell you guys some stuff, and then cut to something else, and then cut back and be like, oh, and then he told them everything you need to know, because, yeah, we already know it, it's not needed for the audience could just be told that, yeah, so-and-so caught them up, and you'd be like, okay, cool. To me, that whole section felt very unnecessary. But it's necessary for those characters, but unnecessary for the audience, and it made the episode a bit of a slog. But they do have to pad out the show, so I respect that they at least tried to show, like, well, this is what the characters found out, and this is how they reacted to finding out stuff about Underworld. And again, it just didn't work for me. If it worked for you, great, that's awesome. It means that you got to enjoy this episode a heck of a lot more than I did, and it doesn't mean that I suddenly hate SAO. Every time I say this episode wasn't as good as the other episodes or something like that, whether that be SAO or Yaiba or any other show, everybody assumes that all of a sudden I hate the show and that I don't like it anymore, and it's very much not that. It just means that this particular episode, I'm not a big fan of. I might skip on a rewatch. That's all that means. Like, if I don't like a specific episode, doesn't mean that I suddenly hate the show. It just means that I didn't particularly like one episode. And again, Sword Art Online, especially Alicization, has been great. Why would I suddenly not like it because one episode didn't really impress me that much? It's an issue, I think, with anybody who talks about anime in general, whether that be on Twitter, on YouTube. The instant you say that, oh, I didn't like that episode that much, people automatically assume, like, oh, he hates it. And it's like, no, I just didn't like that one episode that much. And that's also not to say that the entirety of episode 3 put me to sleep, because that's not true. Again, the stuff with Mr. Miller, the little hints I found to be kind of intriguing. And the scene with him and Sinon was actually really dope. Is it Sinon or Shinon? I've seen it pronounced both ways. I'm going to say Sinon just because that rolls off the tongue a little bit better for me. But Sinon versus Mr. Miller in GGO, that scene was like, it perfectly kind of woke me back up, right? Like, locked me back into the episode, because my mind was drifting, and then all of a sudden, boom, there's Sinon. You're like, whoa, okay, what are we doing in GGO? What's going on? What's happening here? Blah, 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 like, what's happening? And it's kind of neat, because it's not actually, like, you're not seeing footage from the game per se. You're seeing flashbacks of a time that Sinon had in GGO as she's sleeping. She's like having memories of this like really intense fight she had with this character who she doesn't recognize, but we know to be Mr. Miller. And this fight was really intense because it shows just how much more, like, the fact that Mr. Miller is trained in actual combat means that he completely decimates Sinon in GGO, because he already knows the actual moves in real life and knows how to operate them in GGO. So even though Sinon is a badass, and we know that she is, especially in GGO, the fact that she gets taken out that easily means he's pretty intimidating. Basically, Sinon was jobbing for Mr. Miller, but it was dope. And yes, I have to say Mr. Miller every time, because the way they say it in the show, Mr. Miller, is friggin' cool, and I just like it. And yeah, it's totally a squash match. Like, Sinon gets almost no shots in on Miller, and he just destroys her and chokes her out in genuinely kind of unsettling fashion. I don't like seeing my girl get taken out like that, but at the same time, it was a cool action scene, decently well choreographed, and a pleasant surprise in the midst of what otherwise is sort of a snorefest of an episode. That moment really had me intrigued. The only other moment from the episode that I can really point to as like, okay, that's kind of neat, I'm relatively intrigued, is the whole dark territory discussion between this gray-haired dude and this lovely lady. And I don't know anything about either of them, but I know that I thought it was just kind of a charming little moment, because the guy's like, well, if she's dead, why don't we just have peace? And I'm like, hell to the yeah, why don't we have peace? And what I was expecting this whole time, like, as they're talking, is that, because it was such a sweet conversation, I'm like, something's gonna happen. I knew something was gonna happen. So the whole time I'm thinking, like, are they the ones that are gonna get, like, possessed or something? Like, are they gonna get possessed and all of a sudden those dudes inhabit their bodies? But then I was like, no, that can't be, because they already established that they're gonna be inhabiting other characters, like, that they're gonna be diving in as their own characters. That would have been really funny, though, if, like, as he's just like, isn't it time that you officially became my wife? And she's like, oh, why? Of course. And then just in that moment, just bzzzt, and then they they become the Mr. Miller and his lackey. Like, that would have been really funny. But yeah, we already knew from all the technobabble stuff, like blah, 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 they're going to be inheriting their own characters in Underworld. So it wouldn't have made sense for them to jump into those bodies. But I had that thought, and I'm like, that'd be really funny if that actually happened. But I am relatively intrigued by the concept of Miller and his lackey actually entering from the Dark Territory side, since it's actually, like, since they couldn't really track down Alice in the human realm if they were inhabiting like level 1 characters. So the whole plot is like, okay, we do have access to these high tier characters in the Dark Territory, which sucks because it means that we would have to break in to the human territory, but that's fine because we're going to do it anyway because the whole final load test is going to happen. So once we break on through to the other side, pun, we can just go find Alice ourselves. We can just go talk to one of the knights and get them to tell us where Alice is, or just lure Alice out ourselves since we're so crazy powerful and she's going to be fighting for the humans anyway. Honestly, kind of a dope plan. And I do want to learn more about these other 2 characters who they introduce here, the older guy and the girl in the dope-looking purple armor. I want to see a little bit more about them, because you guys know that I'm, like, shipping trash, and anytime I see anything remotely lovey-dovey, I'm like, oh, that's cute. I want to learn more about them. On that note, everybody, and I know I'll get some heat for this, it's part of the reason why I almost don't even want to really rank shows anymore, because it's going to just bum people out and end the video on kind of a sour note, but this episode's gonna have to get a D rank from me. It's just not an episode that I personally enjoyed. There's good stuff in it, but not enough to really bump it up to a C rank. So I'm gonna give it a D rank. Again, I know that's gonna bump some folks out, and I am sorry about that. It's maybe I should just get rid of ranks entirely because I don't want to leave you guys on that note, but here we are. On that note, everybody, that just about wraps everything up. But before we go, as always, I want to give a big shout out to the good folks over on Patreon, namely those in the Earl Grey tier: Calvin Atkinson, Crowbar of Irony, Dominic, Urza, Ginkotaku, No For Nothing, Maria Teresa, Mirth Mouser, Omner Garamond, Cell, Shadow Creative, Sipco Games, Somastan, Steven, Tristan, and Verdon. Thank you all so much for your continued support over on Patreon, and hey, if you too would like to join the T Squadron, then by all means go ahead and check out that first link in the description to check out our Patreon page, see all the cool rewards you can get for as little as $1 a month, and get access to our Patreon exclusive Discord. But on that note, everybody, that's going to be a video, so I hope you all enjoyed, and if you did, you've probably been on the internet long enough to know what to do already, so I ain't going to tell you, but I will say that it is appreciated, and if you are feeling stressed out today, then you go have yourself a warm cup of tea, and I will talk to you all again real soon.